Hello, all. Welcome to another episode of Aaina Podcasts. In this episode, we are talking to Madhulika, who teaches sociology at IIT Delhi. We talk about the value of ethnographic research in education, something that she is engaged with in her PhD as well as later work. She also talks about her experience of teaching sociology to BTech students and co creation of knowledge in the classroom with students. We hope you enjoy listening to this episode and subscribe for more. Hi Madhulika, how are you?
Hi, Vrinda. What a pleasure to be joining this conversation. Thank you for having me participate in this.
Thank you so much for joining, and I'm also really glad we could finally find the time to do this. Just to begin with, could you please give us and our audience an introduction to yourself, your work?
So, I'm a sociologist by training. My postgraduate education, my MA, MPhil, PhD has been in sociology from the Delhi School of Economics, Department of Sociology. I was a journalist before joining academia formally. And for 2 years, I worked as a public health journalist in Delhi with a news agency. And this was also an outcome of my undergraduate education, which was in my media studies from Indraprastha College for Women. So it was during the 2 years of journalism days that I thought there's something like sociology which I would be interested in now that I have to make an informed choice about my postgraduate education. And since then, my work has largely been on education, understanding educational experiences, processes in the larger landscape of many complex institutions and individual players and social actors, broadly understood as sociology of education.
Could you tell us a little bit about your PhD, what you researched on?
So, broadly speaking, my PhD is based on the exploration of educational journeys of Muslim women in urban neighborhoods of contemporary India. I started with the idea of conducting an ethnography of a 5-decade-old minority school for girls in Old Delhi, Balimara, which is understood in very romantic ways and interesting ways as only about food or food walks or heritage and history. But the educational landscape of the old city, of the walled city, was what actually compelled me to navigate further through these bylanes. Eventually, I zoomed out to understand education as a much broader endeavor in the context of the urban neighborhood and also simultaneously in relationship with many other complex institutions like caste, family, kinship structures, marriage, urbanity, and in fact, a much more significant factor being the political backdrop during the times when the fieldwork was being conducted. And I particularly focus on women's educational journeys in school, beyond school, their journeys at work. And that's the tapestry that I have been trying to build on even after my PhD work.
Since you mentioned the fact that this notion around Balimaran and Old Delhi in general, which is very limiting and often stereotypical also, wanted to generally ask in the process of your field work, did you face challenges related to accessing the site, or how did you decide on this as the area, and what the process of the field work was like for you?
Well, in a way, to be very honest, I was also a consumer of some of these narratives about Old Delhi and its food culture, Old Delhi at night, the vibrance of the space, what it offers, everything colorful and dingy. But it's only after a few visits and eventually my larger motivation came from one of the stories I had done as a journalist back in 2011, 2012, which was about a school in Old Delhi in the walled city. It was a 350-year-old school, which had, after a long legal battle, opened its gates for young Muslim women. So now, after 350 years of being a male bastion, this was going to be a co-ed school. You know, there are some stories that never leave you, and this was one of those. It was always etched in my mind, in my heart. I always wanted to go back to the school, see what is life for the young women who were going to be the first batch in this historic institution. But that never happened as a journalist. So as soon as I started doing my MPhil, and which was followed up by a PhD, this was the moment I thought I must return. I must go back. And it transpired into something more meaningful after having understood the history of education for Muslim women in colonial India as part of my MPhil. Eventually, during my PhD, I decided to go back to this school per se. Unfortunately, I could not get access, which is a very important something we should be discussing for scholars working in the field of education. that schools are very hard spaces to access. Yeah. And clearly, they do not want a researcher to be disrupting their everyday life, rightly so. Yeah. So, how do you really navigate these as educational spaces, as research sites or field? Yeah. Having been turned down by this school in particular, I then begin to shift my attention to another school and see if should this be the moment that should just clearly change my research topic, or should I still persist, stay there, and look for other opportunities or other kinds of possibilities, which somehow worked out. Yeah. I got access to another school, which then I realized, has its own history and was barely a bylane away from this one. Yeah. It wasn't very far. But what I also got a sense of was that there was something telling about the educational landscape of the world city in particular. And that was much more important than just individual schools or looking at schools as insulated in silos from the other kinds of everyday realities that were taking place, so that were unfolding in the context of the neighborhood. And eventually I had to, there's rapport building, and you keep going every day. You're seen as an insignificant entity in the school who does not teach, does not do anything, but is there in the school every day. So following up from all of that, eventually, I began to relook at Old Delhi. I also began to rethink about Old Delhi. What did it mean to start your day at 6 in the morning and eventually see the neighborhood take a different or get into a different skin once it turns into a commercial business district? Because Old Delhi has that side to it. And what happens for these young women when the school gets over and they move out from the bylanes to their homes or coaching centers or stand at different nukkad points to have golgappa? What is that life like? So that's what, as a researcher, I also began to see education percolate into the different ways in which the neighborhood was living or shaping lives and living its existence. Yeah. And this wasn't close to any of the blogs or a nice photographic collection of photographs that I would see about Old Delhi on the internet. This was much different. This was about chaos. This was about amenities not being there. This was about shaping an educational landscape for both young men and women. Yeah. And clearly, none of the guides on the internet or blogs on the internet would give me a sense of this. It was through ethnography and being an ethnographer in the walled city that got a bit closer to this reality.
Absolutely. And that also sounds like a very both complicated and enriching experience to have, to also see how education percolates into other realities, but how other realities, as you said, also shape it. Yeah. Coming back to method itself, I think ethnography is a crucial qualitative method, but would you like to just explain what ethnography means and what it meant for you personally also?
Yeah, it's interesting to be also defining ethnography and deliberating on what it has or the kind of meanings it has acquired over the years. One is that you go by a textual definition or a textbook definition of ethnography, of it being as a qualitative method, which includes participant observation, interviews, just being there in the setting, observing, and everything associated with the act of the ethnographer being there, present there, and actively and sometimes passively absorbing and understanding the settings from the respondents' perspectives or from the interlocutors' perspectives. The other is also the larger questions that ethnography as a method has grappled with over the last many decades, from the questions of representation, who is talking about whom, who's writing about whom, who is fit to be writing about whom, and what is it that is being translated, or who is it reaching to? Finally, what is the destination of the ethnography that is being produced, or the publication that emerges from an ethnography? I like to situate ethnography across or at the intersections of all of these questions that it has also grappled with and in fact strengthened itself over the last many years.
I would also want to know, within the space of education, what do you think is the value of ethnography as a method, as a research practice?
Educational ethnographies have been very important to give us a sense of what is it that happens inside schools, or what is the life at school, life in school, and life beyond school life. To get a sense of educational experiences and processes beyond the question of access and dropout and enrollment. And educational ethnographies have surely given us a much better insight into what happens in educational institutions in terms of inequalities, privileges, ideas of merit, and whatnot. Having said that, one of the important dimensions of educational ethnography is also to pull it out from formal institutionalized settings, from the spatial and temporal boundaries of the educational setting per se. You know what you were saying, that education is so much outside the institution also. It continues beyond the walls of the school and beyond the timing or teaching hours of the school. And that absence of formal setting and being able to get ethnography or educational ethnographies to capture it beyond the formal spaces or outside the formal spaces is, I think, surely the need of the hour, which is being attended to and must be also at the same time brought into the folds of educational ethnography. So it's not just understanding what is happening inside the institutions, which we've been able to target or address. You know, schools are no more the black boxes, which they were once, or they were thought to be once. But now, what is happening beyond that? And where are these aspirations, anxieties shaping up? Can ethnography give us a better sense of that? There have been some important and landmark works which have maybe given us a sense of time pass outside the institutions, what is happening when one is not in the classroom, what is happening in the corridors, what is happening at the chai stall outside the institutions, the political parties or the student parties that shape that begin to take form outside the educational life of the institution. But I think there's a strong need to keep building on these kinds of discourses.
Absolutely. And I also feel like it's really important to have more methods of communicating what is happening inside and around educational institutions that doesn't aim to solve a problem but is able to detail and describe what it is also, right? Now that it has been some time since you completed your ethnography, if one ever completes it, where do you situate your work now? And by which I mean, one, how do you see the afterlife of a project such as this? And second, how does it inform your current work, be it research or teaching?
Thanks you. That's also a very provocative question in the sense that one that I've been grappling with for the last few years now, primarily with respect to two dimensions of the question you have asked. One is, what is the afterlife, or when does a work end, or when does an ethnography end? Is there ever an end to it? Is there a closure, or and can a publication be that closure that we are seeking as ethnographers? And the second part of it is, does everything come with a shelf life? And surely do ethnographies or does fieldwork come with a shelf life which must always materialize into publication? Those are two important dimensions which I think the pressure on scholars to continuously publish is also in some ways cyclical and underwritten in what you have asked. I situate this question not only within the context of academia, but this idea of closure, afterlife, shelf life, it has continued or it has always bothered me since I was a journalist. So after having done a story, I would always wonder that can I not go back and follow up on it? Will it be worth it the space, or will it garner the kind of space uh, for the news agency that I work for if I go back and continue to pursue it? Would anybody want me to go back, or am I not needed? I mean, who wants to read or who wants to know about that one person I wrote about in that particular series or piece of news? One of the starting points when this began to bother me, and this is also a little bit of more of an auto-ethnographic reflection, if you can put it like that, was when I was covering Delhi bomb blasts in 2011. Uh, every day I would go to Ram Manohar Lohia Hospital and write about the injured. Going to the same place every day, writing about the same lives, tracing their journeys of well-being, when one person is discharged, when not. It was almost, I think, a good 15, 20 days that I continued to do this drill. And that, in a way, propelled me, continues to, in fact, that's one thing I continue to keep with me, is that one must keep going back. The immediacy of the moment, the immediacy of academic needs in the neoliberal university system demands us to move from one project to the other, from one publication to the other, from one course to the other, every semester. And that's one of the things that semester system does. But in this process, sometimes as a teacher, as a researcher, there are also chances that we tend to lose the touch that we need, the consistency and the persistence that we need to chase certain thoughts. to deeply embed certain perspectives, whether it is the classroom, whether it is the field, whether it is a publication. What is it that compels us to end something and move to the other? And why must it always be that way? So from that particular moment in 2011 till later, when I told you about the story on the school that turned co-ed, eventually having submitted my thesis, defended it, okay, done, fantastic, work on a monograph, rightly so, one should and one must take their work beyond. I have grappled with this question of whether publication is that closure, is that line that separates the fieldwork from the ethnographic outcome. And one that I personally like to dwell on, even as a teacher in the classroom, that having done a particular text, a school of thought, or certain kinds of ideas, and once the student walks out of my classroom, for how long can I, as a teacher, make an effort that the idea stays with that particular student? That it is the idea that they latch on to, or that begins to be the site of germination of several other thoughts. So it's in a way, it's all very interconnected. It cannot be seen as separate from each other. And the question of afterlife in particular is not new. Ethnographers have constantly grappled with this idea that who is it that we are writing for, and what happens once a work becomes public, whether it is as a research, as a talk, as a publication. There could be many ways of making something public. The ways in which I have tried to deal with it is through collaborating with my interlocutors and writing together, thinking together. It is in this act of thinking and writing together, whether it is in the research field, whether it is the classroom, that in some ways I feel I have been able to navigate this with the care and empathy that it requires, and not also feel this sense of machinic entity which is there in academia to perish or publish, which is also not to deride. I must say, when you're publishing something, it also means that you're putting it out there for public scrutiny. For it's no more your own. It's out there to be scrutinized, to be trashed, to be engaged with in n number of ways. But the larger questions at the core of it remain. They are central to our practice. What are we here for in the academy? And what are the ways in which we are collaborating with our participants in the classroom, outside it, in the journalistic field, in the research field, to be able to co-produce something, to co-think, to co-write, and to produce these forms of knowledge which we don't just claim ownership of through a byline or through a particular publication. That's the larger idea, the ways in which I have been trying to deal with this question of afterlife of my ethnographic work. Post my field work, I haven't been able to eject myself out of the field, if I can put it that way. I have gone back to also look at the question of education turning into work-based mobilities among Muslim women in different parts of Delhi. And that's how the work has also panned out in some of the more concrete ways, and not just the theoretical or the epistemological dilemmas that I've been dealing with, but it's in this journeys, or it's in the tapestry of education, work-based aspirations, and workspaces that I've been also trying to put together some chain of thoughts, and to see whether the entire process of education and learning can be seen as in a much more vast landscape. So those are some of the more practical ways in which I'm still there in the field, and still thinking and writing together with who once were my interlocutors, and also meeting new participants in the process. So it's both mentally stimulating as well as thought provoking.
Yeah, it sounds really stimulating. And when you start thinking of this as continuous and ongoing, you also realize that to ever think of this kind of work as individual or hyper specialized, which again is an increasing demand that institutions have. What you said also makes me think that if one has to have a sustained interaction, there are new threads that would naturally open up, right? So you would have to look at work, aspiration, mobility.
Absolutely.
They can't be left behind. But you said about collaborating in both knowledge production and teaching. Could you tell us a little bit about your teaching, what you teach, and who are the students?
So I will complete 8 years in teaching in a month from now, and it's interesting to also be deliberating on this question at a time like this, when I've also been constantly thinking about my teaching practice, craft, what do I envision as a teacher. I started teaching at the University of Delhi. sociology students, undergrad sociology students. And I taught at two colleges before this, Metri College and Indraprastha College. In 2022, I joined IIT Delhi, where I now teach BTech undergrads. I'm also going to be teaching master's students. We have a new master's program here at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. I also teach PhD students here. So it's teaching at 3 different levels at IIT. But before coming to IIT, it had only been social sciences students that I was engaging with in the classroom. So the ideas were kind of easier to disseminate in the classroom. And in some ways, I would also hear from my students at that time that, while teaching a paper on gender, I remember a student once said that some days it feels like an echo chamber. What if there were men in our classroom? What kind of a discourse would we have shaped? And these questions stay with me. They've always stayed with me. So even while teaching at the University of Delhi, I remember I started teaching sociology to non-sociology students. They were social sciences students, but not sociology. At the very outset of my teaching career, this concept of taking sociology to those unfamiliar with the discipline was something which shaped my craft. And one may think that, is this about simplifying a discipline for those unfamiliar with it? Well, no. Is it about selling the discipline? Certainly not. I would be the last person to be selling sociology. And that in a way shapes that, what is it that I need to tell them about sociology? How do I introduce sociology to them? What kind of texts would I want to be playing with? Interestingly, at the University of Delhi, since there's a fixed curriculum, there's a course which you're supposed to be, undertaking. It's a centralized curriculum for the idea that there's a standardized central exam which is to be conducted. So as a teacher, you are expected to stick to that. You can play around with the text, but the window for it is not that much. After having joined IIT, I realized that a couple of these doors have opened. One, I could design my own courses. Two, there were no more social sciences students. These were going to be BTech undergrads. And the idea in itself was initially very daunting. For one reason that, well, will they value sociology? How do I prove my worth? And some of these simply meant that I had to make myself vulnerable out there. I had to accept that I'm vulnerable as a teacher. It cannot be the nosiness of being there in the social sciences classroom where you could talk about feminism, where you could talk about radical pedagogies, so on and so forth. And surely, this does not mean that having this space in social sciences classroom simply meant that the job is done. Even then, one had to climb mountains to be able to, discuss these ideas and simply create a to and fro space or a space for co-creation. But at IIT, it meant a little more, and a lot more, in fact. In retrospect, 3 years down the line, I think it meant that I had to reboot my teaching craft. I had to rethink from the high-handedness of what sociology could mean to social sciences. Now it meant that I had a group, these large-sized classrooms, where sociology was not looked at sociology, but it was a paper they would take as an elective in social sciences. It was this moment of reboot that I began to think that in what ways can I use certain kinds of texts? In what ways can I also dissociate myself from the textual and the dominance of the textual? Is there a possibility for it? And last but not the least, which has been the most important dimension of this reboot exercise, is getting students to speak in the classroom. A lot of times in technical institutions, elite institutions, the classroom discourse tends to lean towards certain kinds of narratives, or towards few students taking that space where they are articulate or they're able to speak. To be able to get them to brainstorm, to be able to get them to think, if not speak, is exactly where this started from. The moment you think that the classroom can be built as a co-created space on the basis of one student's voices, to what they think about social sciences without giving them a sense that they're being patronized or they're being looked at, that they probably they're not critical enough, or they can't think the way social sciences students do. My sense is that those are some of the most important starting points if you are teaching in an elite technical institution. And The moment students get that sense that, okay, they're also participants in social sciences disciplines, they're also very much experience those realities. It's just that they're being introduced to new ways of thinking, ways which at one moment we might want to call radical and critical, but probably, it was the lack of a space that they couldn't think of it that way. And it is in the co-creation of this phase that my sense is that I've enjoyed teaching here a lot, and particularly to the BTech undergrads. These aren't utopias we are creating. A co-created, collaborative classroom isn't a utopia. It is very much can be real, can be felt, can be full of affect, can be full of vulnerability, and can also shift itself away from the text at the core of it. It can digress from that. This primarily, I mean, I think if students' voices are at the core of it, the classroom can be a great space.
But something I want to have a better understanding of, when you say co-creation in a classroom, what does it look like in the day-to-day? What does it mean to co-create in a classroom when it seems like the perspectives or ideas that are being presented in the classroom might be in some kind of contradiction with what they're learning otherwise, both explicitly and implicitly?
Honestly, it is challenging. As easier said than done.
Yeah.
And one can always walk into the classroom every single day with the idea that, okay, it is about going to help them take ownership of a collaborative space. It also means that as a teacher, you're out there. It's also about scrutinizing the self and letting yourself being out there for criticism. Okay? So for a paper on education, that's one of my most effective litmus tests ever, as to what are the ways in which students can feel or can get hold of or can at least be introduced to critical perspectives. And surely there are diverse voices for gender also. In IIT classrooms, there's a clear improving now, but that disparity can be seen. Very few young women as compared to young men who are there. Having said that, I think it has more been about tapping into these moments and grounds where this kind of co-creation can be more effective as compared to those which particularly take the route of the speech, the oral, or the textual. So, for example, certain kinds of assignments are where I am able to tap into these voices much more effectively. Very recently, I had done this exercise of letting the students compare their educational journeys with that of their friends or their grandparents and parents, and to get a sense that what happens when you take privilege as a lens, and what happens when you take lag as a lens. What kind of a different story does it create? And I remember in all the assignments that I got, there was no mention of caste. And these were a good 70 assignments. No mention of caste. But we had a joint session along with my teaching assistants. We conducted a joint session in the classroom as to what are the broad outcomes of their assignment, whether ChatGPT also produced similar stories, or we were addressing AI education and outcomes. After that session, I got two assignments, late submissions. Of course, they apologized, but the student said that it's okay if you don't grade us. We thought that it's more important to tell the story than to, just to be graded. And those were the two assignments which explicitly also spoke about their caste experiences. So sometimes this co-creation is gradual also. Sometimes this co-creation also needs failure. And that is also about acceptance. As a social scientist positioned in a technical institution, I also have to constantly remind myself that I'm not competing with sciences. I must not. To be able to give them a sense that, okay, this course is going to be as rigorous and as difficult, and you're not going to get marks just like your core course, I'm going to put myself in a trap as a teacher. So that co-creation then would mean that I have to focus, I have to be more observant and more mindful of what are these specific moments and what are these specific spaces where their voices, experiences can be generated and they can feel more comfortable articulating them. That could be an anonymous assignment, that could be an anonymous poll that I use, that could also mean their exam scripts. A lot of times, what students who do not speak in the classroom at all end up writing about some of the most provocative and moving experiences in their answer scripts. And particularly if the question is designed in a way that allows them to incorporate their experience. That has also been one of the ways in which I try and get to know them a bit. My mind in the mid-semester exam particularly takes note of this aspect. That's exactly what the craft is. You have to keep ears to the ground. You have to sense that moment. What is working? What is not working? Could this have been done differently? And can I make the exam as this revelatory moment of where my course is heading? And when I say where it is heading, not in terms of academic outcomes, but in terms of what is it that they're learning and what is it that they're not finding interesting. This semester, I remember, a student had also said that it's becoming too repetitive. There's education, and she realizes that constantly it's circling back to the older questions, which in a way is the idea of the course. But for a student unfamiliar with that kind of pedagogical trajectory, that needs to be taken into account. And that must not be, simply glossed or brushed under the carpet saying that, oh no, you're not used to this kind of method, you better change yourself. It's about, making it a much more open, and at the same time a space which takes account of vulnerability as well as criticism. When as a teacher I put myself out there for this kind of a critique also, that what is working, what is not working, if they would like to speak about it, it also means that I'm making myself vulnerable out there. And that's a way of co-creating something, that can students participate in what they're wanting to learn. Maybe they don't like certain kinds of texts. I remember doing Durkheim in the first half of the course, and 90% of the class faced challenges when they had to read it on their own ahead of the exams. So these kinds of challenges are to do with how social sciences texts present themselves, what are the ways in which a STEM student can engage with these kinds of ideas, and what is it that we want them to engage with, the text or the idea at hand or the perspectives at large. What is it that I want them to be owners of, be co-creators of, and be participants of this knowledge that they're producing. So certainly, co-creation involves failure. Co-creation involves getting a sense of where the classroom is headed, what kind of dominant voices are taking lead in the classroom, at what point do I take charge as a teacher and mold it in a different direction. And some days when there's absolute silence and absolute refusal to participate, those days I have to be that first person to start and to share that, okay, this is what I think about it. Okay. It could mean the debate on a podcast. It could mean debate on stand-up, dark humor. These kinds of, the world outside the curricula must also continuously enter the classroom for students.
That sounds really important. And classroom becomes such an important site to get social sciences knowledge out of its silos. What we were discussing earlier also, right, is publication the end of a work. There are so many continuous ways in which that this negotiation happens in classrooms in real time, where okay, people are just learning to think about this, and that wouldn't have happened if it was just a very taught thing of like taught from a textbook. I have one final question. In the long term, almost more philosophically asking this, and this is not necessarily only for students in technical institutes, but for students who are in large neoliberal settings being prepared for very particular kinds of career work directions. What do you think is the role of critical knowledges and perspectives there? And I'm using critical loosely. It is questioning existing thought structures you have, but it is also definitely like understanding structural realities.
That's a difficult question also, and kind of more to do with the existential performances, existential roles that we are taking on, or this mantle that we have taken on as teachers in the current neoliberal university system. And one is that criticality makes life difficult. I've heard it from social sciences students also as part of feedback. You no more begin to look at the same institutions in the same way. You can't find joy in a lot of these pop culture, popular frames of reference in everyday life. And then the moment that it enters consciousness, the world isn't the same anymore. So in an elite technical institution and even at large in the current neoliberal university system, can criticality be thought of as a small or as those small stepping stones to something larger, to the kind of university that we imagine? During the pandemic, there was this question which was constantly being asked, and I remember it was posed in one of these few pieces in New Yorker by Professor Collard, saying that universities are no more cloistered gardens. They are no more the spaces that we think are like the sanctum sanctorum of the educational spaces. They are equally affected by political motivations. The idea of the university is changing. Students also, with privatization, with the push of the markets, so many other forces into play. Education is also changing as an outcome. And or the moment you begin to pose criticality or critical thinking as antithetical to the educational outcome, it is always going to be a difficult project to achieve. It's always going to be a difficult task. So can then critical thinking, consciousness, care, can it be incorporated without really making or without really placing them in the classroom as these radical thoughts which require you to be someone else? And also teaching this generation, it's also more difficult because they're political in different ways. At one moment they would want to be apolitical, but then they're equally political thanks to social media and thanks to the ways in which politics is visible out there. It's very different also from the times that we have been part of institutions back in the day. So certainly, I mean, it means that thinking or placing critical thinking as a way of that, is this also an alternative way to think about the same thing? Can we also think about it this way? My approach has been like that, and it has been slightly helpful, if not completely successful, because it allows us to also place the idea in the classroom that can I also give space to this thought in my head or this disagreement in my head without really completely changing myself or the person opposite. To be very honest, that's a little more realistic also, because it's very difficult to take a black and white approach vis-a-vis critical thinking, that you are either critical or you are this neutral apolitical entity in the current day scenario. And that ends up putting students in boxes. So they'll also put you in a box. They'll say, okay, this teacher is particularly coming from that political ideology, and it completely disrupts, defeats, and dismantles the purpose of education. So over the years, it has been important to also keep revisiting the idea of critical thinking. Critical thinking, not as this outcome solicited, completely finished product that I'm seeking in the student, but more as these tiny drops of, or these smaller threads of consciousness, which may not find a space, but my job is to at least sow them in the classroom.
Yeah.
I mean, my teaching practice is built on students' voices and their questions. And it is these questions that I write in my teacher's diary, which I keep as a separate, this very personal document that I've begun to keep ever since I've come to IIT. The questions that are asked, I feel that they carry a lot of hope. There is dissent, there is hope in these questions. And these questions range from a student asking me in a BTech undergrad classroom that, ma'am, do you really think the world is that bad a place? And that's an outcome when you're teaching social sciences, critical thinking. That's a very naive and a just question to ask.
Yeah.
And my response to that was, well, it isn't. It is the silence that makes the world such a bad place. When you stay silent, and it is that contributes to it. So this dialogic, even talking about what critical thinking is to you and me, for a lot of these students, education is the way it is supposed to be.
Yeah.
As a pathway to mobility. Where do you make space for critical thinking is where the challenge begins. And can I do it without really making it sound like something, a big radical project out there? And can there be more mindful, effective ways of talking about caste in the classroom? Which again comes with its own perils. What happens when you speak about caste and when you speak about marginalized students, Dalit students, Adivasi students in the classroom? It comes with its own dimensions and after effects. But then that's the point, that who is it that you're pandering to in the classroom? It has to be about the last person standing on the last bench who chose to sit on the last bench of the classroom and think and talk.
This has given me a lot to think about, and I'm still sitting with that. But if there's anything else you would like to share with our audience, something that you felt like was missed out on.
I actually had a list of these questions that students ask, some of these provocative ones. Are you a feminist? Or isn't capitalism also providing us jobs? So and this is exactly connected to what you were asking about critical thinking in the classroom as a larger goal, as an outcome in the classrooms that we are part of. I think I'm also quite drawn into this binary of teaching and research, which we had spoken about when we were beginning. And in fact, this binary continues even when you are in a position, when you are in a teaching position. One will end up costing the other.
Yeah.
The misnomer and this it's built along the fault lines that, well, one is going to reap you more benefits as compared to the other.
Yeah.
And if one is invested in teaching, to be very honest, it takes a lot of care beyond your teaching hours, your work hours, which end up accounting for nothing, for no material benefits as compared to a publication. And unfortunately, it's the need is also created by a certain kind of political economy of education system that we are part of. But my sense is that this binary needs to be discussed a bit more across different spaces. Aaina is doing a fantastic job with it. Thanks to platforms like these, that we are just discussing, we are talking about pedagogies, what works, what does not work. And from the point of view of both teachers and students, there is a strong need to continue to discuss that. Can we always operate in these binaries of teaching versus research? Can it be teaching and research? Teaching as a more powerful way of shaping research, or vice versa. And that will be beneficial to both students and teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm also curious about how to make this a more everyday institutional conversation. So how do we visibilize pedagogy, right? So not only thinking of it in terms of how materially it can be incentivized and what structures can be in place to recognize teaching work, that's equally important. But even research on pedagogy, whether pedagogy can be a conversation that, okay, not only some people who are inclined towards it are having reflection around that, how can it become like a mode of operating in an institution? And it is hard, it is also extra work in some ways, but I think it would be very rewarding and stimulating to have that as a part of like institutional lives of teachers.
It would, in fact. So until it is not, I think that reward and affirmation and all of those joys of care would have to be, they'll have to find their way in student voices, and how they still remember something, or they return to you, or they end up knocking your door even when there's no formal interaction as such. Until then, until there's some institutionalized way or some acknowledgement of the care, the practice of care, until that happens, my sense is we all end up some days fatigued, but on most days energized by these questions and efforts that we make in the classroom.
Thank you so much. That's a great note to also end on. Yeah, this was a great conversation. Yeah.